Tehran, August 1953. The streets were loud before they were violent. Crowds moved through the city chanting slogans, some for the Shah, some against him. Posters were torn down. Newspapers changed their tone overnight. Rumors spread faster than facts. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was still in office, but his time was running out. Inside government buildings, uncertainty hung in the air. Orders were issued, then countermanded. Military officers hesitated. Politicians waited to see which way the wind would turn. What almost no one in those streets fully understood was this: the outcome had already been engineered beyond Iran's borders. In Washington, the Eisenhower administration had approved a covert operation to remove Mossadegh. In London, British officials, furious over the nationalization of Iranian oil, had pushed relentlessly for intervention. Publicly, the language was about stability. Privately, it was about control. 2 years earlier, in 1951, Mossadegh had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, ending British dominance over Iran's petroleum industry. To many Iranians, it was an assertion of sovereignty. To Britain, it was economic sabotage. To the United States, it was something more dangerous: instability in a region bordering the Soviet Union. The Cold War was tightening. Iran sat on strategic terrain: oil reserves, proximity to the USSR, access to the Persian Gulf. In Washington's strategic calculus, losing Iran to political chaos, or worse, to communist influence through the Tudeh Party, was unacceptable. So the CIA moved. The operation was given a name: Ajax. The British called it Operation Boot. Money was allocated. Iranian newspapers were bribed. Clerics were approached. Politicians were persuaded. Street gangs were quietly funded. Military officers were identified as potential allies. The goal was simple: remove Mossadegh, restore the Shah, reassert Western alignment. But coups are rarely clean. On August 15th, the first attempt failed. Mossadegh learned of the plan. The Shah fled the country. For a moment, it appeared the operation had collapsed. In Washington, officials feared exposure. In Tehran, the streets grew louder. Then, something shifted. 3 days later, on August 19, 1953, crowds once again filled the capital. This time, elements of the military moved decisively. Mossadegh's residence was attacked. By the end of the day, he was under arrest. The Shah would return, and Iran would never view the United States the same way again. Because what happened in those August days was not just a power struggle. It was the beginning of a rupture. One that would echo through revolutions, hostage crises, proxy wars, and nuclear standoffs for decades to come. The coup succeeded, but the consequences were only beginning. The crisis did not begin in 1953. It began in 1951 when Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. For decades, Britain had controlled Iran's oil through a concession that overwhelmingly favored London. Profits flowed outward. Iranians saw little benefit. The resentment was not abstract. It was economic, visible, and political. Mossadegh capitalized on that anger. He was not a revolutionary in the modern sense. He was a nationalist, educated in Europe, committed to parliamentary process, popular across wide segments of Iranian society. When the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the oil industry, it was seen domestically as an act of sovereignty. In London, it was seen as a direct threat to imperial interests. Britain responded with economic warfare, a global boycott of Iranian oil, legal challenges, naval presence in the Persian Gulf. The objective was to force Mossadegh to reverse course. He did not. Iran's economy began to strain under sanctions and embargoes. Oil revenues collapsed. Political polarization deepened. In Washington, the Truman administration hesitated. Early U.S. policy favored mediation between Britain and Iran. American officials were cautious about direct intervention. Mossadegh was not viewed initially as a Soviet proxy, but the Cold War lens was tightening. The Korean War had begun in 1950. Communist expansion was no longer theoretical. The Soviet Union bordered northern Iran. The Iranian Communist Party, the Tudeh Party, was active and organized, though not in control of government. To British officials, this was the argument that would persuade Washington. If Mossadegh's government collapsed under economic pressure, the Tudeh could exploit instability. A weakened Iran might drift toward Moscow, and oil fields near the Soviet frontier were not something the West was willing to gamble on. In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower won the U.S. presidency. His administration brought a different strategic posture. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles were more willing to authorize covert action to prevent perceived communist expansion. The British intelligence service, MI6, had already developed plans to remove Mossadegh. What they lacked was American partnership. That changed in early 1953. The CIA approved Operation Ajax. Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, was assigned to coordinate efforts on the ground in Tehran. The plan relied on pressure, not invasion. Propaganda campaigns would portray Mossadegh as unstable and anti-Islamic. Religious leaders would be encouraged to turn against him. Members of parliament would be bribed. Military officers loyal to the Shah would be mobilized at the right moment. It was not designed to look American. It was designed to look Iranian. Meanwhile, Mossadegh's position weakened internally. His decision to dissolve parliament through referendum alienated some supporters. His consolidation of authority gave critics ammunition. Street clashes between rival factions became more common. Iran was tense. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was cautious and uncertain. He feared failure. He feared being exposed. He feared that if the coup collapsed, he would lose the throne permanently. And for a moment, that is exactly what seemed to happen. On August 15, 1953, a royal decree was delivered dismissing Mossadegh. The attempt backfired. Mossadegh arrested the officer sent to remove him. The Shah fled Iran for Rome. The coup appeared dead. In Washington, officials debated whether to abort the mission. In Tehran, the streets were shifting again, because covert operations rarely move in straight lines. And the most dangerous moment in a failed coup is not defeat. It is the decision to try again. When the first attempt failed, many in Washington assumed the operation was finished. The Shah had fled. Mossadegh remained in control. Exposure seemed imminent. But on the ground in Tehran, Kermit Roosevelt Jr. made a decision that changed the outcome. He stayed. Instead of withdrawing, CIA operatives intensified efforts. Money flowed into Tehran's political networks. Newspaper editors received payments to print stories portraying Mossadegh as anti-monarchy, anti-Islam, even secretly aligned with communists. Clerics were encouraged to denounce him. Organized street groups were mobilized. The goal was momentum. On August 19, 1953, that momentum turned kinetic. Pro-Shah demonstrators gathered in central Tehran. Some were genuine monarchists. Others had been paid. Violence spread. Police units fractured. Military officers previously identified by the CIA began moving armored units through the city. Radio stations were seized. Government buildings were surrounded. By afternoon, tanks advanced on Mossadegh's residence. Fighting erupted. The house was shelled. Loyalists scattered. By evening, Mossadegh had fled and later surrendered to military authorities. The coup had succeeded. The Shah, who had fled to Italy just days earlier, was informed the throne was his again. He returned to Iran on August 22nd to a carefully staged public welcome. Operation Ajax had achieved its objective, but the narrative was immediately contested. Officially, it was described as a spontaneous uprising in defense of constitutional monarchy. In reality, it had been carefully engineered, amplified by money, coordination, and foreign planning. It is important to separate myth from fact. The CIA did not single-handedly manufacture Iranian politics. Mossadegh had domestic opponents. The clergy was divided. The military was not unified behind him. Economic instability had eroded support. But the coup tipped the balance. It transformed internal instability into regime change. And it marked one of the first major Cold War examples of American-backed covert overthrow of a foreign government. In Washington, it was seen as a strategic victory. Oil stability restored. A pro-Western monarch secured. Communist expansion contained. Short-term objectives had been met. Long-term consequences had not yet been calculated. Because coups do not end when leaders fall. They end when legitimacy fractures. And in Iran, legitimacy had just been altered in a way that would not be forgotten. The Shah returned to Tehran stronger than before, but not more secure. After 1953, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi no longer ruled as a constrained constitutional monarch. With American backing and British support, he began consolidating power more aggressively. Opposition movements were monitored. Political dissent narrowed. In 1957, with assistance from the CIA and Israel's Mossad, the Shah established SAVAK, Iran's internal security and intelligence service. Its mandate was counter-subversion. Its methods became synonymous with surveillance, detention, and repression. To Washington, Iran became a pillar of regional stability. The country sat at a strategic crossroads, bordering the Soviet Union, overseeing access to the Persian Gulf, and holding vast oil reserves. Billions of dollars in American military aid flowed into Tehran over the next decades. Iran purchased advanced U.S. weapons systems. It became a central partner in America's containment strategy. On paper, the policy worked. Iran did not fall to communism. Oil flowed. The Soviet Union did not gain influence in Tehran. But stability built on repression carries a cost. Inside Iran, a different narrative hardened. Many Iranians did not see 1953 as a rescue from chaos. They saw it as foreign interference overturning a popular nationalist leader. Mossadegh had not been universally loved, but he had symbolized sovereignty. That memory did not disappear. It moved underground. Through the 1960s and 1970s, as the Shah accelerated modernization under the White Revolution, land reform, women's suffrage, industrial expansion, political dissent remained tightly controlled. Clerical opposition grew. Secular nationalists were sidelined. Leftist groups were suppressed. Economic modernization without political participation created tension. And beneath it all was the unresolved question: who truly decided Iran's future in 1953? By the late 1970s, that question resurfaced with force. When mass protests erupted in 1978-1979, the memory of Operation Ajax was not forgotten. It was invoked as proof that the United States had manipulated Iranian sovereignty before, and would do so again. When the Shah fled in January 1979, he did so without the decisive American backing that had saved him decades earlier. The Islamic Revolution that followed was not caused solely by the coup, but 1953 shaped the psychological terrain. It reframed the United States in Iranian political imagination, not as neutral partner, but as intervening power. And once that perception takes hold, it reshapes generations. In 1953, Washington believed it had solved a problem. Oil access was stabilized. A pro-Western monarch was restored. The Soviet Union was kept at distance. In Cold War logic, it looked efficient. Covert action instead of invasion. Influence instead of occupation. But strategic victories are judged over decades, not days. Operation Ajax became a blueprint. It demonstrated that the United States could remove a foreign leader without deploying conventional forces. That lesson would echo in Guatemala in 1954 and in other interventions during the Cold War. The method appeared validated. Yet in Iran, the cost accumulated quietly. For many Iranians, the coup confirmed a suspicion that sovereignty was conditional when Western interests were at stake. Mossadegh became a symbol, not of perfection, but of interrupted self-determination. When the U.S. Embassy was seized in Tehran in 1979, the hostage-takers explicitly referenced 1953. In their narrative, the embassy was not just a diplomatic building. It was a reminder of foreign orchestration. The anti-Americanism institutionalized after the revolution did not emerge in a vacuum. It was layered, historical, reinforced by memory. Even in modern nuclear negotiations, sanctions disputes, and regional proxy conflicts, 1953 lingers beneath the surface. Iranian officials invoke it as precedent. American policymakers view it as a Cold War necessity shaped by its time. Both interpretations coexist. The deeper lesson is structural. Short-term stability achieved through covert regime change can generate long-term distrust that outlives the original threat. Intelligence services can remove governments. They cannot manufacture legitimacy. The coup did not create the Islamic Revolution, but it narrowed the path between the two. And once trust between nations fractures, rebuilding it becomes exponentially harder than breaking it. The summer of 1953 lasted only days. Its consequences are still unfolding. If you've followed this story to the end, consider this. Was Operation Ajax a strategic necessity of its time, or a miscalculation whose costs were simply delayed? Let me know your perspective in the comments.